What's up, poker friends? This session was played back in May at Prime Social in Houston, Texas. This is when I started more regularly playing the 1025 game, and I would say this was my first really successful shot take. There's some really cool pots. I thought I played really well throughout the session, and I hope that you enjoy it. Let's get into it. Start off this session with an above average hand when I look down at pocket aces and middle position. I raise it up to $75, and to my excitement, the player in the cutoff decides to 3-bet to $200. The player in the cutoff is Richard, the comic book king of Houston. He is the owner of Bedrock City Comics. I definitely recommend anyone in the Houston area check him out. I think typically he's going to be 3-betting a pretty strong range here. He does get out of line occasionally, but I would expect most of his 3-bets to be on the value side. I think I have a pretty clear 4-bet against his range here, and when it gets back around to me, I make it $500. He tanks for a little bit, and ultimately he decides to shove all in for $3,150, and obviously this is the result I'm looking for, and I snap call. I show him pocket aces, and he shows me ace king of hearts. We run out one board, and the board runs out the king of spades, 9 of diamonds, 6 of diamonds, 2 of hearts, and 3 of spades. So my aces do hold, and I scoop this 6.3K pot. Outstanding start to the session. Unfortunately, it had to be against a good friend of mine. I open up 6-5 of hearts from middle position to $75, and I get 3-bet by the young pro in the hijack to $250. It folds back around to me, and I have an interesting decision here. I think this hand's going to be a mix of mostly call and fold. I don't mind calling this hand when I'm this deep. This hand has the ability to make straights, flushes, and some different 2-pair and trip combos. It's a hand that unblocks all of my opponent's overcards, so it's very rare that I'm ever going to be dominated here unless he has specifically ace-6 or ace-5 suited. And for the most part, I kind of know where I'm at. If I have a weak pair, I probably have to often fold to a lot of aggression. Otherwise, I'm looking to hit mostly straights and flushes or play my hand aggressively on boards where my opponent misses. I make the call, and we go heads up to the $535 flop. The flop is the ace of diamonds, 9 of hearts, 4 of hearts, giving me the flush draw. I check, and he continues for a small sizing, betting $125. I think that my opponent's generally going to be using a small size here, although I would expect him to be betting a little bit larger. Against this small size, I definitely want to be raising at a slightly higher frequency. I think that my hand benefits a lot from fold equity, only being 6 high here, and I obviously have quite a bit of equity with my flush draw. I bump it up to 375. He tanks for a little bit, and he decides to fold, primarily trying to just get a lot of overcards to fold here, hands like king, queen, jack. I expect him to continue with all of his ace-x combos. I also expect him to have relatively tough decisions if he has something like pocket 8s or pocket 7s that he decided to c-bet for a little bit of denial and value. Regardless, I think it's good to have an aggressive line here at some frequency, and this time it worked out pretty well for me. In this hand, we have an under the gun min raise to 50 from a tighter recreational player. I look down at pocket 9s in the hijack. This is a hand I'm going to be mixing raise or call with. I've been trying to call a little bit more versus early position opens with this specific hand instead of playing it as a 3-bet, and I elect to make the call in this scenario. The young pro in the cutoff decides to squeeze to $200. I think that this specific player is 3-betting a very wide range in general. I think when we get this specific configuration where a recreational player opens and I elect to call, I think he's going to be squeezing an even wider range. So I expect this 3-bet to contain a lot of broadways, suited ace-x, and some pocket pairs that wouldn't be 3-bet here by a lot of other players. The under the gun player makes the call, and I think I have a pretty interesting decision here. I think I have a pretty clear continue given the price I'm getting, but in this specific spot, I think that a 4-bet makes a lot of sense. The under the gun player would generally be 4-betting all of his stronger hands. I don't expect him to have aces, kings, queens, or jacks at a very high frequency, or something like ace king or ace queen. He could have something like pocket tens that's slightly above me, but I think if I 4-bet, I'm going to be pushing him off of those type of hands. I think I also have a lot of fold equity versus his suited Broadway combos, and I'm fine if he folds a hand like pocket eights, pocket sevens. And then against the young pro, because I think that he is 3-bet squeezing so wide, I think that pocket nines is probably quite a bit ahead of his overall range here. I elect to 4-bet to $750. Maybe a little bit large here, but I think being out of position versus two players, it's perfectly fine. The young pro thinks for a little bit and he ends up 5-betting to $1,600. So I think the young pro doesn't think I have a very strong range here. Like I said, he expects me to 3-bet most of my strong hands versus this under the gun player, and my back raise looks a little bit awkward and probably weak to him. I don't think he expects me to have a hand as strong as pocket nines here. I think he thinks my range contains a lot of broadways here, some weaker pocket pairs, and probably some suited ace-x combos. The under the gun player folds, and given the young pro's image, I elect to 6-bet shove here for $4,500. I think that my pocket nines is still ahead of a large portion of his range, as hard as that is to believe. I think he is one of the very few live players that is going to be 5-bet bluffing here. I think that I do have some fold equity as well, so if he does have a hand like king queen, ace jack, I think I can get him off of those at some frequency. The young pro tanks for quite a while, and ultimately he does flick in a call. We decide to run out 2 boards, and I'm hoping I can at least take down one of them. The first run out is the queen of hearts, king of clubs, 2 of clubs, 8 of diamonds, and 6 of spades. And the second run out is the jack of diamonds, 10 of spades, 6 of hearts, 3 of hearts, 7 of diamonds. So 2 very, very clean run outs for pocket nines. Don't imagine how we don't scoop. All of the overcards, the broadways they've gotten here on a pair on one of the boards. If my opponent had something like pocket eights, pocket sevens, he's made a set on one of the boards. Being the out of position player that took the aggressive action, I show my pocket nines. The young pro tanks for a little bit and he ends up mucking. And I end up scooping this 9.2k pot that I just shoved pocket nines as a 6-bet for 4.5k. The young pro ended up calling me with a suited ace-x that he was bluffing with, but then given the stack sizes, he did think he was committed. I don't think he's wrong. I don't think that that is a play I would generally make. I think I was a little bit stronger than he expected. If I have a hand like ace-king, he has 3 outs against it. If I have a weaker pair, I think he thinks he's flipping. And even if I have something like pocket queens that I took a really weird line with, he's also got 3 outs against that. So quite the call by him. Thankfully, both runouts worked out really well for us, and we're starting off really strong in this 10-25 game. In this hand, we have a cutoff open from Robinhood to $75, and the Daka Felt decides to flat in the small blind. I look down at ace-4 of diamonds in the big blind. I think that this is a perfectly fine hand to squeeze, but I'm going to be calling here pretty frequently as well. I decide to make the call here, getting a pretty good price, and we go 3 ways to the flop with the pot at $225. The flop is the ace of clubs, 7 of clubs, and ace of spades, giving me trips. The Daka Felt checks, and I think I have a pretty clear check, letting the pre-flop raiser continue if they want to. He does continue for $125. I think that he's going to have a lot of ace-x here. A lot of his ace-x combos are going to be quite a bit stronger than mine. He can also have a hand like pocket sevens. He's also going to have a lot of weaker hands, something like 7-6 or pocket sixes, pocket fives that he's deciding to bet for denial. He's also going to have a lot of flush draws. I would also expect him to be continuing here with his hands that have backdoors, so something like the king queen of spades, the 10-9 of spades, something like that that can pick up straight draws and flush draws. I think that a lot of his complete air probably gives up, but I'm not entirely sure. The Daka Felt calls here. I think when the Daka Felt calls here, he also has a lot of the ace-x combos. I think he's generally going to have stronger ace-x combos than me as well, although he could have something like ace-3 or ace-deuce. Although those type of combos are going to end up chopping with me by the river the vast majority of the time anyways. I think he's probably calling a lot of his pairs, especially his 7x and better, especially if they have a club, and then I would expect him to be continuing here with flush draws. I think that he's probably not going to be as wide as Robin Hood is here. I think generally he is going to have a pair or a club draw, as having backdoors doesn't really make sense with a player behind left to act and him being out of position. Given that both my opponents could have stronger ace-x combos than me or pocket sevens, and I'm against two players, I elect to call. We go three ways to the turn with the pot at $600. The turn is the jack of spades, bringing in some of those backdoor draws. It checks to Robin Hood and he continues for $225. I do expect him to be barreling here with a lot of his flush draws, and then any of the backdoor draws that have now turned equity are probably barreling as well. Like we said, something like King Queen of Spades, 10-9 of Spades have picked up quite a bit of equity. The Dockefelt once again calls. At this point, I think it's pretty rare that my opponent has a weaker pair. I would expect him to fold versus a second barrel, especially after I've called flop. So I think my opponent either has a 7x of spade combo, a ace-x combo, or a flush draw. So he has a pretty strong range here, and I think that I have a pretty clear call again versus this range. Both of my opponents could still have quite a few stronger hands than me, and I think even though I have trips with the weak kicker here, I'm getting in a pretty horrible scenario when I raise and my opponents continue here. Obviously, there's some value in charging some of the draws, but I think that my opponents often have pretty high equity draws like combo draws, and against that range and ace-x, I don't think my raise is going to be too profitable. I make the call, and we go three ways to the river, which is the 9 of hearts. Really no draws have completed here, maybe exactly 10-8 of clubs or 10-8 of spades. Only Robin Hood can really have the 10-8 of spades, and I wouldn't expect the Dockefelt to have too much 10-8 of clubs that called pre-flop and didn't raise the flop or the turn. So for the most part, I think I'm losing to stronger trip combos and possibly a slow played pocket sevens. The Dockefelt interestingly leads for 400 into both of us. I think for a while, I think there's some merit to folding my hand, but I think on this specific board, there is a lot of draws that I've missed, and I do think that I'm now chopping versus a lot of the medium and weaker ace-x now with the ace-ace-jack board. So I'm now chopping with ace-8, ace-6, ace-5, ace-4, ace-3, and ace-2, on top of being ahead of a few bluffs here. And given the sizing, I think I have a very good price, so I do throw in the chip to call. Robin Hood makes the fold, and my opponent gets very lucky and he shows ace-8, and we end up chopping. So the 9 on the river now plays, and we both have trips with a jack and a 9 kicker. Lucky us, and we'll both be chopping this pot and getting 1.5K back. At this point in the session, I'm sitting pretty deep, and I decide to open up my range just slightly, and I open up ace of hearts, 2 of diamonds from the button to $75. A tighter reg in the small blind makes the call, and we go heads up to the flop with the pot at $175. The flop is the 4 of hearts, 5 of diamonds, 10 of hearts. I flop an overcard, a gut shot straight draw, and the nut backdoor flush draw. I think this is a board that my opponent does probably have a decent amount of continues when he does call the small blind, but I think with multiple barrels I can probably get him off of a lot of hands. Hands like pocket sixes, pocket sevens, maybe something like 10-9. Although realistically I think that my hand can probably go either way, I decide to continue with a bet here for $40. A little bit on the small side. I accidentally misread the pot size and was thinking that I used a third sizing. So my sizing on the flop and the turn on this hand is going to be a little bit on the small side. My opponent quickly calls, and we go to the turn, which is the 7 of clubs. Interesting turn card. I think that my opponent is going to have a lot of hands that picked up a little bit of equity. Something like 7-6 has now made a pair. Something like pocket 8s now has an open ender. He's going to have some 7 of hearts combos. So I think overall this does interact with my opponent's range when he calls the flop. I think if he has something like a 10x combo, he's going to continue either way. So overall, I think this is probably a pretty good card for my opponent. I do still have that straight draw and that overcard, and I plan on repping hearts if it comes in. I do want to have some bluffs here, and I think that my specific combo is a pretty good candidate still. So when he checks, I do decide to barrel here for $150. He thinks for a little bit, and he does make the call. At this point, I'm trying to fold out some equity hands like weaker flush draws, maybe some 4x, 5x that can fold. I don't expect him to have too much weaker 4 or 5x, but hands like ace 4 or ace 5 I think can make the fold here. Obviously something like 6-5 is going to continue. I think it's reasonable that he folds here sometimes with something like pocket nines, although with my small sizing I would expect him to continue. The river is the queen of hearts, completing the obvious flush draw on the board. And interestingly, my opponent decides to lead for just under half pot and bets $250. I think overall the queen of hearts is going to be quite a bit better for my range, especially when I have the ace of hearts here. I obviously know that my opponent cannot have any of the flush draws. I'm going to have some hands like ace queen, queen jack that have decided to barrel turn and now have hit top pair. I also have more combos of hands like queen 10 than my opponent, as I don't expect him to have the offsuit combos pre-flop. I also still have all of the over pairs here as well, and I think it's actually really hard for my opponent to have a queen X combo here. He shouldn't really be continuing flop and turn with a hand like ace queen or king queen, and so realistically the only value hand he has is something like queen 10. Obviously, if it was an offsuit queen, he could have the queen of hearts. So I think my opponent is relatively capped here. Obviously, he could still have some flushes here as well, but overall, it's hard for him to have too many strong hands. Because of this, and while having the ace of hearts in my hand, which is the ultimate blocker in this scenario, I decide to raise to $875, really trying to apply pressure on hands that are trying to get to a slightly cheaper showdown. Something like 10x or something like those pocket nines, pocket eights, 7-8 combos that don't want to necessarily call a huge bet from me. So I think a lot of times he's trying to find out where he is, so I'm letting him know that I have the nut flush. He tanks for a little bit and ultimately he does make the fold, so we get this nice little bluff through. In this hand I open up ace king offsuit from early position to $75. It folds around to the big blind and he defends. We go heads up to the flop for a pot of $160, and the flop is the king of hearts, 9 of clubs, 10 of spades. Overall, I think this is going to be a pretty good flop for my range. I have a lot of the stronger king X combos, all of the sets and over pairs. Surprisingly, my opponent decides to lead large for $125. I think typically these donk bets are going to be top pair, but on this specific board, I could definitely see a hand like queen 10 or jack 10. I think typically with my hand, I'm probably supposed to be raising against this bet and trying to get a lot of value from those hands that are a pair plus a straight draw. He has a lot of weaker top pair hands that I can gain a lot of value from, like king queen and king jack, and I also expect weaker king X to continue here as well. He definitely could have some two pair and some possible straights here as well though. In the moment, I decided to just make the call. We go to the turn with the pot at $410, and the turn is the 6 of hearts, which really shouldn't change too much unless my opponent has specifically 8-7 and has now made a straight. I guess they could also have a hand like the 10x, 9x of hearts and could have picked up a pair plus a draw or have something like a combo draw. My opponent decides to continue barreling, and this time bets about pot for $400. At this point, I don't think I really want to be raising too much versus a pot size bet. I think I'm now getting close to bluff catcher mode. I'm obviously still ahead of a lot of his value range, which is like king queen and king jack, but I think this board texture is getting just a little bit scary, and his sizing is a little bit polarized towards stronger hands in general. I don't necessarily want to bloat the pot versus a set, a two pair combo, or a made straight, so I just make the call being in position, and we go to the river with the pot at 1.2k, and the river is the jack of spades. Definitely not a river card that I'm loving too much here. If my opponent had a hand like king queen or king jack, which was the primary hand that I was ahead of, they are now beating me. If he had a hand like queen 10, queen 9, or jack 10, he's now made two pair. So overall, I think my opponent does have a lot of straights here. It's also really hard for me to get value if my opponent does have a hand like king 8, king 7, something like that. I think it's really hard to gain too much value here as well. My opponent thinks for a little bit and he checks, and I pretty quickly check back. I start to flip over my ace king, and my opponent tables king 10 of diamonds for flopped two pair. So it ended up actually being a pretty good run out for me in the sense that I really lost the minimum on this river. At no point in the hand did I raise, so this pot could have been so much worse for me, so I'm pretty glad to get out of this hand and only lose $600. At this point in the night, the game's gotten pretty big. The maniac to my right has recently sat down with 10k. I'm sitting there with a 10k stack, and so is one of the other players. And upon the maniac sitting down with 10k, one of the other players reloaded to just over 10k. So stacks are super deep. There's been a lot of aggressive pots, and we're gonna play a big one here and fight for as many trips as possible. We have a limp in the cutoff to $25, and the very aggressive player on the button raises up to 150. I have Jack 10 of diamonds in the small blind. Generally just going to be playing this as a 3-bet, especially versus a button open. I bump it up to 575, trying to go about 3.5 to 4x his raise. It folds around to him and he makes the call, and we go heads up to the flop with the pot at $1,200. The flop is the 7 of diamonds, 7 of spades, 2 of hearts. Overall, I think this is a board that I'm going to be c-betting a very high frequency. It shouldn't really be interacting with my opponent's range too much. Obviously, he's pretty happy when he has overpairs like 8s, 9s, 10s, but he's also going to have a lot of other broadways and ace-x hands, some of which should be calling with their back doors. But I think overall, people are probably overfolding this spot. I decided to continue here. I'm going to be using large sizes overall, as I have all of the stronger pocket pairs that my opponent doesn't have. I c-bet for $750 into $1,200. He thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. Like I said, once he makes this call, I think he's mostly weighted towards pocket pairs. I do think he has some ace king, ace queen, ace jack with backdoor flush draws. Possibly something like ace 10 or king queen, although I think those are going to be folding still at a pretty high frequency. He might still be calling with some of his ace queen off hands. I do expect this player to primarily be 4-betting all of their ace king combos and the vast majority of their ace queen combos though. The turn is the jack of clubs. At this point, I think I probably have the best hand here. Like I said, he has a lot of overcards and he has a lot of pocket pairs here. Realistically, the only hand that's ahead of me now is something like ace jack. I don't think he's probably floating flop with king jack, even with the back door. I guess there's a slight possibility that my opponent has a hand like ace 7 or 8-7 suited, but I think it's pretty rare here. And now our hand's pretty much gone from a pure bluff where we're going to barrel turns where we picked up some equity into a pretty clear value hand against this opponent in this spot, and I think I want to continue for a large sizing, mostly just trying to get value from his pocket pairs and possibly a very sticky ace queen style of hand. I continue here for 1500. He thinks for quite a while and ultimately he makes the call. We go to the river with the pot at 5.7k, and the river is the 8 of spades. If my opponent has specifically pocket 8s, I'm in trouble, but he still has a lot of combos of pocket 9s, pocket 10s, some of those ace-x combos. I think he also probably has a lot of hands like pocket 6s, pocket 5s as well if he decided to 3-bet those. I think this player is 3-betting a very high frequency, so it's definitely possible. He could also have something like ace-deuce suited. From his point of view, I think it's pretty hard for him to put me on too many value hands outside of specifically aces, kings, queens, and jacks. I don't think he would expect me to have barrels with weaker pairs. I guess I could have like an ace jack as well, but I think I'm probably slightly weaker than he would expect me to be betting for value here. Overall, I think it's probably a little bit thin, but I think against this opponent with this specific run out, I think my hand is still a value hand, even in a 3-bet pot, and we're gonna go for a size of 2700. He tanks for a couple minutes, really thinking about this hand, and ultimately he does look me up. I show the jack 10 for top pair weak kicker, and he mucks, and we scoop this 11k pot to end the session. Hell of an end to the session. Really happy with my play on this hand. Really happy with the shove with pocket 9s earlier. So big game, but trying to show no fear, trying to really play a lot of my hands aggressively if I think I'm ahead, and it worked out really well this session. Absolute monster session at 1025. I'm absolutely ecstatic with the results. I made about 12.5k, one of the most profitable sessions that I've played. I thought I played very well overall. I was very aggressive in a lot of spots and really tried to maximize my value. And thankfully, it really worked out for me. Obviously, starting off the session with aces versus ace king really helps as well. Overall, just really happy with how I played, and hopefully it's the start of a couple more sessions of this magnitude. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Thanks.